I get a lot of emails from beginning story artists or students trying to break into the storyboarding world for the animation industry. And they'll send me their portfolio or animatic, and I give them some feedback here and there. But I've also noticed some common things and elements that actually holds them back. So I want to talk about that in this video. By the way, Raid Shadow Legends is a game. Okay, bye. Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and today I'd like to talk about common mistakes that beginner storyboard or story artists make all the time. So I've worked as a storyboard artist for both feature and television animation. Therefore, I also look at storyboard portfolios. And when I look at storyboard portfolios, I think about three criterias. Number one, is their storytelling capabilities clear? So when I look at the storyboards, I actually know what's happening, I know how the characters are feeling, I basically know what the story is in these storyboard sequences. Number two, can they adapt to different productions and styles or genres? So do they have their foundations down, whether it's drawing, whether it's storytelling, storyboarding? If they have their foundations down, they can adapt to other productions. If they've shown a bit of variety in the types of stories they can tell, whether it's comedy, drama, action, they have a scope to be able to do those if they do switch productions. And number three, would I hire them? So when I look at their storyboard work, can I actually see them be used in an actual work environment or a production? Does the quality of their work match with the professionals currently in the industry? Things like style, aesthetics, execution, that's all supplemental to me. But can I actually see this in a professional production? Now, because studios and productions have different styles from each other, I recommend you to find a pool of artists that you sort of look up to and use them as reference for the type of work that you want to do in the industry. Now, the first one I'd like to talk about is staging inconsistency, and a lot of beginning story artists tend to break the 180-degree line or the staging line in their storyboard portfolios. Imagine there are two characters in the scene and they're connected with this invisible line. A rule of thumb is that you want to keep the camera generally on one side so the staging between the two characters remains consistent, and there's a reason for this. Now, I don't think switching characters and going beyond that staging line is wrong per se, but the common mistake that I see beginning story artists is that they're unintentionally changing it or switching it. So let's say you have two characters talking, right? And then in the next shot, you kind of switch the camera to the other side, so it makes it feel like the characters switched places, staging-wise. And then another common trait I see is that they switch the camera again in the next shot after that. So my suggestion is, before you even board, draw a layout of your scene with your characters, draw the line, and just figure out where you want to plan where your cameras are. And of course, there are ways to break the 180-degree rule. The first one is if you're intentionally creating disorientation or chaos. Number two is the characters move around the environment and switch places. This also involves boarding out camera moves. And the third one is that you've established the sequence enough where you already know where all the characters are before. And this leads to the next common mistake that I see: the lack of establishing shots or staging shots. So a common trait I see with a lot of beginning story artist portfolios is that none of the characters feel like they're grounded on something. You can't really tell where they're at. There's a lot of upper waist or really close-up shots. You can't really tell where they are in the scene. Now, usually when people think of an establishing shot, it's a wide shot of the whole environment where you can see everyone. But it doesn't have to be just that. It can be any shots where you can actually see where all the characters are placed in the scene, the fact that they're grounded and how far or close they are. Now, if this is intentional, this can make everything feel disorienting, maybe claustrophobic. But if it's not intentional, think about pulling the camera back so you can actually see everyone in the scene. Vary up the shots, and just ground the audience and the characters, really. So implement those establishing shots, whether you're describing the setting, the staging, how spaced the characters are from each other. One small tip and hack that a lot of storyboard professionals look for in beginning story artists is a basic understanding of perspective. So add those perspective lines or grids in your storyboards, especially when your storyboards are rough and loose. That makes a scene and characters feel a bit more solidified and grounded, even if the drawings are super loose. The other one I can think of is excessive cuts and unintentional jump cuts. So I'm going to start with the excessive cuts. Sometimes when I look at a beginning story artist's animatic or a story portfolio, there always has to be a cut for some reason. Like when a character starts talking, there's a cut. And then when another character starts talking, there's a new cut. When a character does a different action, like they reach out for something or they bend to lean over, there's always a different cut. And what this does is that it makes the whole sequence feel a bit hectic, like there's just no break, there's no pause in it. And I would say use cuts sparingly. I would only use cuts if it had a certain purpose or if it had a strong purpose behind it. Sure, you can have a different cut for every time a different character opens their mouth or when they say something new in the sentence, but what if you just stayed on one shot where these two characters are talking, where you can actually see the performance of these two? Or if you just wanted to focus on mood or atmosphere, just to recalibrate the audience into the scene again. If you want to see a bad example of cuts, look at the Taken 3 chase scene. There's like 15 different cuts for one simple action, the camera switching all over the place at the same time too. And sure, some people can argue it's to create intensity and to make you feel disoriented, but seriously, it's like this for like 4 minutes, and some of those cuts are unnecessary. Now the other one I want to talk about is jump cuts. So a jump cut usually happens when a shot has a certain composition and the next shot literally has the same composition, even if the context is different. And this is usually to create an abrupt transition, and it works on things like a quick jump in time, or a different state, or maybe trying to say something else between these two subjects. Now, because of how abrupt the transition is, it can be jarring, especially when it doesn't need to be a jump cut. Maybe it's just two characters talking. Sometimes it might also feel like the shot really hasn't changed. A thing that I see in storyboard portfolios is like two characters talking, it's an over-the-shoulder shot for both characters. Every time a new character talks, it takes the perspective of the opposite character but using a same shoulder shot. That's also quite a jump cut because the composition is so similar. And of course those things can easily be fixed by replacing one of those shots with a different composition. Maybe it's a close-up of the character, or maybe it's a side profile of that character. Now I don't think jump cuts, whether it's compositional or whether it's an editing thing, is bad per se. But if you're going for a very specific shooting style, it's all conscious decisions, then I think it can work. But whenever I point it out in a beginning story artist portfolio or animatic, they often say that they don't realize it. Now, another one that I can think of is a lack of variety in terms of shot angles or compositions. When I look at storyboard reels or storyboard portfolios, there will be some sequences where there's no variety in terms of shot language, cinematic language. The shot angles are always the same. It's always like a waist level shot, it's flat, and it's like this throughout the whole sequence. And of course there's appropriate sequences that retain the style where the shot composition is always the same throughout. I'm not saying that this is wrong, but if this person wants more cinematic shot choices, or shot choices that emphasize the story, think of shots that say something about the characters, the actual story, the emotions, the tone of the overall scene. So if a character feels small and weak, allow those shot choices to make those characters feel small. If you want to show a character that feels intimidating, make them feel big and take up the whole space in that composition. Or you can just vary up the shot choices, add in some over-the-shoulder shots, implement some wide shots, some profile shots. That's why I would always recommend thumbnailing your story sequences before you actually start boarding them, so you can actually see how many cuts there are, if the shot choices are too little, if there's enough variety, or do the shots actually say something about the whole sequence. And then the reverse issue of that is too much dynamic shots, Dutch angles, really stylized wide angle shots, where it's just dynamic just for the sake of looking cool. But what happens is that these dynamic shots don't really serve any story purpose, whether it's emphasizing how a character feels, the tone, the emotion, and it's just dynamic throughout the whole sequence. What happens is that it feels like there's no resting point or there's no establishing point, and everything just feels way too intense. And you can balance those out with great compositions that actually serve the story, how the character feels, and mix it up with more mundane shots, more medium shots, more calmer shots, just so you know how to organize all those shots. Lack of acting is another thing that I'd like to point out, and this is something that I didn't learn until I was already in the industry. In school, I wasn't really told much about acting for storyboards, but at work, it was always talked about. And now when I look at my old work and when I see beginning story artists' portfolios, the character acting in their storyboards are rather robotic, or they're just really basic expressions. Like the most basic smile, the most basic anger, basic sadness. A lot of animation productions are looking for board artists who can do acting and specific expressions. And maybe this is something that character animators who are switching into storyboarding have an advantage over. So really get into the mindset of your characters, what are they thinking, and see if you can try and blend different expressions and emotions into one, like switching anger and sadness together, or switching happiness and hate. And a successful acting drawing for comedy will make that gag shine even better. Remember, if you're dealing with characters, characters are the ones that drive the story forward, but you also have to be able to make your characters emote, even in storyboards. So if acting isn't your thing, I recommend you get a mirror, act it out, record yourself, and use that as reference, or study reference from actors. And something that I want to bring up is something that I learned when I was a trainee at DreamWorks Feature Animation, and that is pinpointing the overall point of the sequence. When we were trainees, we were each given a sequence for a mock feature film that won't be released, but it was just for training purposes, and we were all given a sequence for our first act for this supposedly movie. Now, the first time we were doing our boards, I made the mistake of trying to implement everything because I wanted to impress the senior story artists of what I can do. So I tried to put drama in the sequence, I tried to put action in the sequence, and tried to put in a few jokes. But what happens if you add too much of so many ideas is that sequence loses its point. So if you're doing a dramatic storyboard sequence, make that dramaticness shine. If it's comedy, really amp up those gags. If it's action, go ham crazy about that. If it's a crucial moment for the character or a turning point for the story, really make that storyboard sequence that. What I'm trying to say is have a clear end goal for that story sequence, whether it's a character's end goal or the overall point of that sequence. Keep it focused. So I've talked about most of the common mistakes that I see from beginning story artists or students trying to get into the storyboarding world in animation. And you know what? Most of these mistakes are unintentional. Well, that's the thing with common mistakes, but the reason why I bring these ones is because a lot of productions are looking for story artists who have a good handle on these things, on these specific things. Now, the competition for story artists is just growing, but there's also a big pool of people who don't have the chops to work as a board artist in the industry yet. In most cases, you learn on the job. Some people learn when they're hired in as a story revisionist, and eventually story revisionists get promoted to being story artists. But nowadays, in order to even be qualified for those training positions or those early entry-level storyboard artist positions, you have to have a decent portfolio that shows that you have the chops or the potential to grow as a great story artist. Anyways, that's all I want to say. Bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.